I'm Dr. Ana Nogales, Las Comadres Board Secretary. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our keynote speaker now, Dr. Muñoz Martinez. She's Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. Her book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, received 6 book awards. Monica co-founded the award-winning project Refusing to Forget and helped to secure 4 state historical markers commemorating the history of anti-Mexican violence. She's a 2021 MacArthur Foundation Fellow, and earlier this year, Monica was named a National Honoree of Women of the Year by USA Today. Congratulations to you, Monica. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I can't follow through the Lotus Puerto. Still,
what an honor, right?
What an honor, what a privilege. I'm lifted up by her words and encouragement. So I should start. I'll begin. So I'm going to share my screen to give a quick presentation on some of the history that I have helped recover through my research and writing and public work, to share some of the lessons of fierce comadres that have inspired me and who I know can inspire future generations, that I am participating, in collaborating with historians, but also community members to make sure that the lessons of the past can help inform a more just future. And then I also want to talk about some of the work that I'm doing in Uvalde, my hometown, that is still working to try to put the pieces of broken humanity back together in the aftermath of the tragedy that happened at Robb Elementary on May 24th last year. So I'm going to share my screen. Share. Let's see, can you see it if I press presentation view? Okay, can you see it? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So the book that I wrote, The Injustice Never Leaves You, is a history of racial violence in Texas in the early 20th century. And it recovers a period between 1910 and 1920 that was known as La Matanza, the massacre. It was a period of severe and brutal anti-Mexican violence. We estimate that hundreds, if not thousands, of victims were murdered, and thousands more witnessed those tragic events. The victims were accused of, what we would describe today as a period of racial profiling, that anybody who looked Mexican, whether they were American citizens or Mexican nationals, were profiled as being a threat, as being violent, and as being a threat to American society more broadly. And so they were denied due process, they were criminalized. And what I found, unfortunately, was that during this period, somebody's citizenship, their gender, their class, their age, and their status did not protect people from violence. And so some of the cases that I've recovered were young children that were murdered. One including was Concepcion Garcia, who was a 9-year-old girl who was attending school in Texas, but her family lived in Mexico. They crossed, her mother and her tia crossed to go and pick her up from school and bring her back home so that she could recover. She was only 9 years old. And on crossing the US-Mexico border into Mexico, a border guard suspected them of smuggling, he later said, but he shot over 50 rounds, killing Concepcion. Her parents, her mother, her father, went on to sue the US government, denying them, accusing the US government of murdering her daughter their daughter was murdered by a US border agent, denying them due process because the border agent was not prosecuted. And they used international courts to seek justice, and they did receive a financial indemnity. And so I was really struck and in awe of the courage of mothers, of widows who fought for their rights during this very violent period. It was a period where aggressors of racial violence included vigilantes, but they also included local law enforcement, Texas Rangers, and as the example from Concepcion, US soldiers. And so when people were seeking justice, when women were seeking justice and seeking protections for their loved ones, they were doing so during very dangerous circumstances and when they were, of course, very vulnerable. And we know from this period that aggressors acted with impunity, and very rarely was there ever prosecutions, even investigations into these crimes. One real chicona that I learned about with the comadres, I feel like I can call her that, is Jovita Edad. She was a journalist. She was a bilingual educator. She wrote for the Spanish language press for newspapers like La Crónica, that was owned by her father, and was published out of Laredo, but she also wrote for other newspapers. This is a photograph of her standing with two journalists at the press El Progreso. And she was somebody who documented not only during this, or in the early 20th century, anti-Mexican violence. She wrote about the violence that was occurring. She wrote about the lynchings that she and others were witnessing, or the violence. And the press that she's photographed here with was actually demolished by Texas Rangers. So according to local accounts and oral memory, Jovita Edad stood in the doorway and didn't allow the Texas Rangers to come in when they tried. And it wasn't until they came back days later that Jovita wasn't there, that they did burn down the press. But she wrote about all of the injustices that she witnessed. She was a suffragist and organized women to vote, to advocate for the right to vote. She also organized women to also empower themselves, to seek an education, to use their words and to voice their opinions through political acts, but also in writing. And so she had a career of being a civil rights and a human rights activist who organized binationally. Her family organized a civil rights conference in 1911 in Laredo, and invited people from both sides of the border to talk about the rights of people, fronterizos and fronterizas. And so she really helped to advocate for the rights of border communities, for the rights of Mexican and Spanish language school children. She also protested the policing and militarization of the border, and was a fierce critic of segregationist policies that were being introduced, English-only policies, for example. And so she's somebody who, in our times when we're seeing laws being passed that reduce women's rights, that reduce the rights of the LGBTQ community, she's somebody who we can learn from, because she was working on so many fronts as an advocate for social justice. And again, we are living, unfortunately, during a period where children and people are afraid of gun violence. And she was somebody who called for change when she saw the kinds of violence that was taking place, and the vulnerable populations, especially people that were profiled as Mexican, were experiencing. I'm so glad that this summer, she's going to be honored by the U.S. Mint as a part of the 2023 American Women's Quarter project. It's going to be issued and circulated, I believe, this summer. And so I'm glad to know that despite the efforts to try to restrict the kinds of histories that can be taught, that Jovita Edad is going to be in wide circulation and people will be able to learn from her. This is a photograph of Epigmenia Bazán and her granddaughters. This is her standing in the early 20th century on her porch in her homestead. Epigmenia Bazán, like Jovita Edad, lived during this very violent period. She was not a journalist. She didn't publicly protest, but she kept her family and her community alive. During this violent period. Her husband and her son-in-law were both murdered by Texas Rangers in 1915. And during this era, the common refrain was, you don't buy land from the husband, you buy from the widow. And Epigmenia Bazán and her daughter Antonia Longoria, they lived on property that their families had owned for generations. They could trace their belonging back to Spanish land grants. And so during this period, they were targeted with violence. But Epigmenia Bazán refused to leave her land. The only land that she sold off was for a local church. and to have a cemetery. And so she is an example of somebody who was fierce in protecting her family, in refusing to leave her property, and somebody who I helped to teach about. Her granddaughter, Norma Longoria Rodriguez, lives in San Antonio today. When I asked and Norma Longoria Rodriguez has been so important in preserving the history of her family, recording the story of her great-grandmother and her grandmother, and helping to pass that along to younger generations. When I asked her why she spent so much time preserving that history, she said to me, it's an injustice, it never leaves you, it's inherited loss. And so she has committed, and like generations of comadres have committed to preserving our own histories, preserving the stories of women who have worked to advocate for change, and passing on those lessons with younger generations. I worked with Norma Longoria Rodriguez and other descendants of violence, and my colleagues, other historians, to start a nonprofit, Refusing to Forget. And we worked to successfully unveil a museum exhibit in 2016 with the Bullock, Texas State History Museum, where we preserved and presented some of these histories. That photograph of Epigmenia Bazan and her granddaughters was on display there. And we also worked, Norma Longoria Rodriguez, and the picture on the right is in the center, and she's over here by the historical marker. We also worked to unveil historical markers so that future generations can continue to learn these histories. I'll also say that I've taken these histories outside of the classroom and outside of museums and shared them with Congress. I gave testimony in 2019 after the tragic massacre in El Paso to talk about the striking parallels between the anti-immigrant rhetoric that was used 100 years ago and that was used today. And just to wrap up, I want to just share some lessons from my hometown of Uvalde. I grew up in Uvalde learning about the work that women and children and parents did to advocate for social change, especially during the civil rights era. I learned about Genoveva Morales, who helped to sue the school district after a school walkout in 1970 had failed to make change. She successfully sued the school district with the help of MALDEF. This is a photograph of 4 women, including Olga Rodriguez, who's in the center standing, who's my tia, who helped to continue the legacy of Jovita Eydad. She opened a newspaper in Uvalde to help document the perspectives of Mexican Americans, to educate the community, and to advocate for change. And this is a photograph. These are stills of my mom on the left, and on the right is my dad, who were children. They were students, high school students at the time of the Uvalde walkouts. And so I grew up hearing the stories of people committed to social change, people volunteering their time, organizing with each other, building communities to have a stronger platform to be able to advocate for change. And so I've learned from my family, from my tias, from my mother, from my abuelas, that we have to work together and call out injustice in all of its forms, to use our resources, our skills in multiple ways. And so we've continued this work in Uvalde to call for gun reform, but also to call for resources to meet the needs in the community of Uvalde. The mothers in Uvalde who lost children have been fierce in advocating for change, of speaking truth to power. This is a screenshot of Kimberly Matarrubio, who lost her daughter Lexi, going to Ted Cruz's office and asking him to support gun control. He refused, but Kimberly is just one of the mothers who has been fierce in advocating for change and been unwilling to stop, despite the pain that they are still feeling in the aftermath of the massacre. And this is Jasmine Cáceres, who's just 17 years old. She lost her sister, Jackie. And she reminds me of people like Emma Tenayuca, who started organizing for labor rights, for women's rights in San Antonio when she was also a teenager. And so when I see youth that are involved in making change, they are building on a long legacy. And just to conclude, I've been working with professors at UT Austin to help run a needs assessment in Uvalde and to help organize a public health education campaign. And I have been inspired by the incredible work of women like Mayela Castañón, who have been she's the CEO of the local clinic in Uvalde. Her clinic provides support and public health resources for over 60% of the residents in Uvalde. But she's a part of a group called Team Uvalde. And it is a group of almost exclusively Mexican-American women who have been meeting for 2 decades to bring more public health services to Uvalde and to maximize the resources that are available. And they have really been leading the charge to meet the needs in Uvalde. And I'll show one photograph here of me with my colleague on the far left holding the backpack, Gloria Gonzalez Lopez. She's one of the professors that's been traveling with me to Uvalde. Mayela Castañón is right next to me. I've got the lipstick on. And then that's my tia Irma and my mom, who travel with me when we take trips to Uvalde to help with this needs assessment and the public health outreach campaign, because I have to bring my baby. I have a toddler who I'm in the bathroom right now because she's taking a nap. But, you know, the work that I do requires community. And so I'm so glad to learn from the experts, to learn from the women who have been meeting community needs for decades, and to learn from the generational wisdom so that we can build a better, more inclusive, more just future. So I'm so inspired by this community, and I'm grateful for spending time with you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. That was inspiring, motivating. You're so brave. Just like all comadres should be brave, be daring, be bold, be adventurous, be kind as well. Thank you very much for being here.